Chicago, Friday night, 7:42 p.m. Snow was falling hard. Daniel Carter, a 28-year-old delivery driver, raced through downtown traffic on an old scooter. His phone buzzed again. Urgent delivery, customer waiting. Daniel looked at the address, Blake Estate. The name alone made him nervous. Richard Blake owned hotels, technology companies, private jets, and billions of dollars. Daniel had $43.17 in his bank account, and tonight he was already 18 minutes behind schedule. "One more late delivery and I'm done," he muttered. Then he saw her. An elderly woman was sitting alone outside a closed pharmacy. She was shaking violently. Her coat was far too thin for the freezing weather. People walked past her. Nobody stopped. Daniel looked at his delivery bag. Then at the woman. His phone buzzed. Delivery delay, 18 minutes. Daniel sighed. His weekly bonus was already in danger, but he pulled over. "Ma'am," the woman slowly raised her head. "I'm sorry," her voice was barely audible. "Do you have any water?" Daniel immediately pulled a bottle from his backpack. "Here." Her hands were shaking too badly to open it. Daniel opened the bottle and held it for her. She drank. "Thank you." Daniel noticed something strange about her breathing. "Are you okay?" "I'll be fine." "No, you won't." Daniel reached for his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance." The woman's eyes suddenly widened. "No." Daniel froze. "Why?" She looked around nervously. "I don't want them to find me." "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his wrist. "What is your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel what?" "Daniel Carter." The woman's face suddenly went pale. "Carter?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, why?" She stared at his face as if she'd seen a ghost, then his hands, then his eyes. Her lips trembled. Before Daniel could ask anything, an ambulance arrived. The paramedics rushed over. One asked Daniel, "Are you family?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I just found her." As they lifted the woman onto the stretcher, she suddenly reached for Daniel. "Please." Daniel leaned closer. "What?" she whispered. "Don't give the key to anyone." Daniel's expression changed. "What key?" But the ambulance door slammed shut. The vehicle disappeared into the snow. Daniel stood there confused, then his phone buzzed. Delivery now 31 minutes late. Daniel looked toward the Blake Estate address. He had no idea the woman had just changed his life forever. 40 minutes later, Daniel arrived at Blake Estate. The mansion looked like a luxury resort, massive gates, private security, a driveway stretching farther than most city blocks. A guard walked toward him. "You're late, I know." "There was an emergency." The guard looked at Daniel's worn jacket. "Everyone has an excuse." Daniel said nothing. He handed over the package. "Where do I sign?" Before the guard could scan it, a deep voice came from the mansion. "Bring him inside." Daniel turned. A man in his late 50s walked down the steps. Richard Blake, the billionaire. Richard looked at Daniel and suddenly stopped. His face went pale. "What is your name?" "Daniel Carter." Richard stared at him. "Say it again." "Daniel Carter." Richard stepped closer. "Who sent you here?" "My delivery company." Richard shook his head. "No." Daniel frowned. "I was assigned the order." Richard stared at Daniel's face, then whispered, "Carter." Daniel became uncomfortable. "Sir, is there a problem?" Richard looked at the guards. "Close the gates." The massive gates slammed shut. Daniel turned around, then Richard said something that made his blood run cold. "You look exactly like my brother." Daniel stared at him. "Your brother?" "Michael." Richard led him into the mansion. Daniel wanted to leave, but something told him to stay. Inside the billionaire's office, Richard opened an old cabinet. He pulled out a photograph. Daniel looked at it. His heart stopped. A young man stood beside a woman. Daniel knew the woman. He had grown up looking at her photograph. His mother. Daniel's voice shook. "Where did you get this?" Richard looked at him. "Do you know her?" "She's my mother." Richard closed his eyes. For almost 30 years he had believed his brother and Michael's partner were dead. Now Michael's son was standing in front of him. "Who raised you?" Richard asked. "A foster family." Richard slowly opened another drawer. Inside was an old newspaper. The headline read, "Local businessman and pregnant partner missing after highway crash." Daniel stared at the date. 29 years earlier. Richard pointed to the photograph. "That was my brother." Daniel's hands began shaking. "What happened?" Richard's voice became bitter. "Michael discovered someone inside the company was stealing millions." Daniel looked at him. "How much?" Richard stared directly into his eyes. "Billions." Daniel suddenly remembered the elderly woman, the key. His hand moved toward his wallet. Richard noticed. "What is that?" Daniel pulled out a small brass key. Richard's expression changed instantly. "Where did you get that?" "My mother gave it to me." Richard stepped closer. "Did she tell you what it opens?" "No." "What did she say?" Daniel remembered her words. "Never lose this. One day you'll understand." Daniel placed the key on the desk. Richard stared at it. "I thought this was destroyed." "What is it?" Richard opened a hidden safe. Inside was an old photograph of two brothers, Richard and Michael. Richard pointed at Michael. "My brother carried a key just like this." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Richard's voice dropped. "Our father built a private vault beneath this mansion." "What was inside?" "Company records." Daniel waited. Richard continued, "Ownership documents." Daniel looked at the key. Richard whispered. My brother was going to expose everyone who was stealing from the company. Daniel asked, what happened to him? Richard looked away. He disappeared. Daniel suddenly remembered something. There is someone you need to see. Richard looked at him. Who? The woman I found outside the pharmacy. Daniel showed him the photo he had taken while waiting for the ambulance. Richard froze. Where did you find her? Outside a pharmacy. Richard's voice trembled. That's Margaret. Who is she? My father's nurse. Daniel looked confused. Richard continued. She was the last person who saw my brother alive. Daniel's eyes widened. She recognized my last name. Richard immediately grabbed his coat. Take me to her. At the hospital, Margaret was lying in bed. Daniel entered first, then Richard walked in. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. I knew this day would come. Richard stepped forward. You knew who he was? Margaret nodded. I've known for 28 years. Daniel's voice became angry. You knew my family. I knew your mother. Then why didn't you tell me? Margaret looked at him sadly. Because your mother made me promise. Promise what? Margaret took a breath. To keep you alive. Daniel went silent. Margaret explained everything. Michael had discovered billions were being secretly moved out of the company. He knew the people responsible would come after his family, so he created a trust that would eventually belong to his son, Daniel, but before the documents could be transferred, Michael disappeared. Margaret looked at the key. Your mother never trusted anyone with that vault key. Daniel whispered, Where is the vault? Margaret looked directly at him. Under the Blake mansion. Richard's face went pale. The vault was never opened, Margaret smiled, because nobody had the key. Daniel looked down at the brass key in his hand. Suddenly he understood. His mother hadn't protected money, she had protected him. Back at the Blake mansion, Richard took Daniel underground. A hidden elevator descended several floors. The doors opened. A dark concrete hallway stretched ahead. At the end stood a massive steel door. Richard looked at Daniel. You open it. Daniel inserted the brass key. Nothing happened. Then click, the door opened. Inside was a metal box. Daniel slowly opened it. Documents, bank records, company certificates, photographs, and one envelope. His name was written across it. To my son Daniel. Daniel's hands trembled. He opened the letter. His father's words revealed the truth. Michael hadn't abandoned him. He had disappeared because he knew powerful people wanted him dead. He had placed his company ownership into a trust for Daniel, but the final words were the ones Daniel couldn't handle. His father had written, Money is only useful when it helps someone who has less than you. Daniel lowered the letter. Tears rolled down his face. Richard looked at the documents, then froze. Daniel, how much? Richard swallowed. Your father's original ownership was 22%, and today, Richard looked at the valuation. His voice became almost a whisper. Approximately $1.07 billion. Daniel stared at the number. $1.07 billion. The broke delivery driver suddenly owned more money than he had ever imagined. But he didn't smile. He cried, because all he could think about was his mother. Richard finally told Daniel the truth. Your mother survived the crash. Daniel froze. What? She escaped. Then where did she go? She disappeared to protect you. Daniel shook his head. She left me. No. Richard's voice softened. She stayed away because she believed staying close would put you in danger. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. So she never stopped loving me. Never. Richard looked at him. She watched you from a distance. Daniel whispered, Where is she? Richard shook his head. I don't know. Daniel stood. Then we find her. For weeks, Daniel and Richard searched hospitals, shelters, old employment records. Every lead ended nowhere. Then Margaret remembered something. Your mother once mentioned a small town in Michigan. Daniel went there. They searched for days. Finally, an elderly shopkeeper recognized the photograph. She lived in that blue house. Daniel's heart began pounding. He walked toward the house. Knocked. The door opened. An older woman stood there, gray hair, tired eyes, a trembling hand holding a coffee cup. Daniel stared at her. He didn't need proof. He whispered, Mom. The cup fell from her hand. It shattered. The woman stared at him. Daniel. They ran toward each other. For the first time in almost 30 years, a mother held her son. Daniel cried against her shoulder. You were alive, she sobbed. I watched you from far away. Why didn't you come back? Because I was terrified. Terrified of what? That they would find you. Daniel pulled away. I thought you didn't love me. His mother broke down. I loved you so much. She held his face. That staying away was the hardest thing I ever did. 6 months later, Daniel officially inherited his father's shares. His net worth crossed $1 billion. The media went crazy. Mystery delivery driver inherits billion-dollar fortune. News reporters surrounded his mansion. Business magazines wanted interviews. Companies wanted partnerships. But Daniel didn't change. One morning, his mother saw him putting on his old delivery jacket. She smiled. You're still doing deliveries? Daniel laughed. Just one. To whom? Daniel picked up a grocery bag. Someone who needs it. He drove to a small apartment. An elderly woman opened the door. Daniel handed her the groceries. I didn't order these. I know. Who paid for them? Daniel smiled. Someone who knows what it's like to have nothing. The woman began crying. Daniel walked away, but someone had recorded the entire moment. The video went viral. Millions watched the billionaire delivery driver helping a stranger. A reporter finally caught him. Daniel, why do you still deliver packages? Daniel stopped. He looked into the camera. Because becoming rich taught me something. What? People don't always need your money. He paused. Sometimes they just need to know someone sees them. The reporter asked, don't you want to live like a billionaire? Daniel looked down at his old delivery jacket, then smiled. I already do. 1 year later, Daniel launched a foundation. It helped elderly Americans with emergency medical bills. It supported struggling delivery workers. It provided food for families facing eviction. And it funded education programs for adults rebuilding their lives. In the foundation's first office hung one photograph, Daniel's father and mother. Underneath it were the words, what you inherit matters less than what you do with it. Richard became Daniel's business mentor. Margaret received a permanent home and lifelong medical care. And Daniel's mother finally lived near her son. No more hiding. No more running, no more secrets. One evening, Daniel sat beside his mother on the porch. She looked at him. Your father was always afraid the money would change you. Daniel smiled. Did it? His mother shook her head. No, she held his hand. You changed the money. Daniel laughed. How? She looked toward the city. You turned $1 billion into 1 billion chances to help someone. Daniel looked at his mother. And for the first time he understood what his father had meant. The fortune wasn't the inheritance. The heart behind it was. Years later, people still told the story of Daniel Carter, the broke delivery driver who suddenly inherited more than $1 billion, but Daniel always corrected them. I didn't become a billionaire the night I opened that vault. He would pause, then say, I became rich the night I stopped my delivery scooter for a woman nobody else noticed. Because that night I learned something money could never teach me. He would look at the person listening and say, sometimes the person you think has nothing to give is carrying the one thing the world needs most, kindness. Daniel inherited billions, but his greatest inheritance wasn't the company, it wasn't the mansion, it wasn't the money. It was the heart of 2 parents who sacrificed everything so their son could survive. And every time Daniel delivered one more package to someone who needed help, he carried that inheritance with him. Because the greatest billionaire isn't the person who owns the most. It's the person who can give the most without making someone feel small.